Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College. And today, we're very fortunate to have Holly Barkas, distinguished professor of geography at Macalester College. Holly, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Mike, for inviting me.
You're so welcome. We're really glad that you're here. As with all people interviewed, I ask, what really sparked your interest in geography? Perhaps it was something in your childhood, growing up. Maybe you could comment on where you grew up and how that might have influenced you, and also talk about your studies in geography at college and university.
Sure. Well, I guess to start out with, I grew up in a number of different places. My father was in the Air Force, so we moved around. Every 3 years, we went to a new place and met new people and saw new places and landscapes. And so much of his curiosity about the world was I think handed down to myself, my sister, and just the idea that you can see a landscape, but you also have to step back and kind of look at the processes that create that landscape.
Mm-hmm.
Those were all, I think, really formative experiences. Just having that curiosity, seeing it in other people.
Where were you specifically?
We were in Nebraska and Alabama and Virginia and Hawaii, and later on they moved back to Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
So moving here to Macalester was a move back towards family where I'd never lived before. But
mm-hmm.
Yeah. So as I was saying with the moving around, even after high school, I had a chance to work in East Africa for a little while. And again, just building on that idea that I was really interested in people and how they engaged with place and how they went about their lives. I remember, looking through all the magazines, the National Geographics as a child. They were all, photographs of different places of the world. And so I guess I was just always attracted to that aspect of geography. And I still am. Those are the places I enjoy working. Those are places that are remote, places that are maybe less known, certainly by me and
Mm-hmm.
maybe by lots of people. So exploring those more remote rural places has always just been part of what I enjoy about geography.
And after high school, you went to UNC Charlotte.
I did. And when I was at Charlotte, I had the pleasure of working with Owen Furseth and Tim Moore and Dennis Lord. All of those guys were really influential. We did lots of field work. I worked on small grants with them, engagement with the community in different classes. And that all really appealed to me. Just the idea, at that time I was really interested in urban planning.
Mm-hmm.
And
which was a very strong concentration there.
it's a very strong concentration and a very applied concentration, one in which we went out and we were engaged with planning processes in the city of Charlotte and Mecklenburg County planning organizations. And so a lot of hands-on activities that really appealed to me, that idea that we could think about a city, that we had an influence over how the city evolved, the things that were important, that you could talk to people who lived in neighborhoods and understand both their history and current challenges. All those things really appealed to me. And I started working with Wei-Ning Xiong there as well with GIS. And I think together with those GIS skills and the City Within a City project at Charlotte, that really cemented both my desire to have in many ways, a practical skill, but one that also had kind of a big imagination. Like, how do we think about the world and how do we engage with different processes that create different outcomes for different people?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So Owen was really influential, but so were, so many other people who were there.
And you decided to pursue a master's degree while you were there.
I did. I discovered geography late, like lots of people do. I think I was probably a junior when I realized that geography was a discipline that really spoke to me.
Mm-hmm.
The type of work I do now, you could think, oh, well, some of it overlaps with sociology or anthropology. There's lots of ways you could go, but geography I think with all those different skills, whether it was the GIS, the urban planning, that interest in people and landscape sort of all came together. And so I stayed for a master's then for another 2 years. And then after that, I took a year off and I worked for the Minnesota Department of Transportation and in their sustainable transportation initiatives, and had the opportunity to go out and really apply what I knew in terms of geography, but also learned a lot about focus groups and working with rural communities and understanding their transportation challenges and opportunities. We worked a lot in, remote northern Minnesota on different projects that the community were engaged with. And I think that really inspired me to go back for a PhD then at Kansas State.
Was it your work then in Minnesota in that year that you took off between master's and PhD that really fueled your focus in rural geography?
It did, and surprisingly, because we were living or working anyway in St. Paul, so a very urban area, very much, in line with an urban area like Charlotte had been. But it was the projects there that cemented my interest in rural. Now, if you know Owen Furseth, he's a big rural geographer and urban geographer. He kind of does both. And so that, in so many conversations with him about the different directions I could take, because I knew I wanted to do something that was different from MnDOT. I wanted to go back and do a lot more research. I really enjoyed that process. And so that was the basis for the decision to go to Kansas State, which had a rural geography program.
Right. One of the few in the country that concentrated on rural geography.
Right. Especially then, it was one of the very few. And so
it was a new PhD program.
Yeah.
And Chuck Bussing was instrumental there.
He was, and by the time I got there, he was retired, but he was around a lot. So I got to see him and really worked with a number of people, Max Liu in particular, and the Harringtons. Both Lisa and John were
rural geographers as well.
Rural geographers, but also, working both with people and the environment. There was a really strong focus there on being a well-rounded geographer, about thinking broadly as well as having your own specialty. And I think that's where not only the rural in terms of the environment, where do I work, but also that question of migration, which is a big focus of my research in rural places. So kind of that place and topical.
Will you comment on your dissertation research?
Sure. I have to try to remember my dissertation research, Mike. I looked at why people move from urban to rural places, and I used the American Housing Survey to do it, which essentially asks questions of people based on the housing unit, not necessarily the people there. So it follows housing units through time and the different people who live in those places. So you can select out rural places and you can understand there's a lot of sections of the survey, but the section I was interested in is why did you move to a rural place and are you satisfied with that decision? And so really focusing on the migration decision aspect of rurality. And, of course, we can look back at different waves or different periods in time when rural places have grown. And then, of course, when they've declined, and we see this, back and forth. And interestingly enough, we're moving into a period where it seems like rural places are growing again. Post-pandemic, people can live and work far from an urban center. They can work remotely. And so that's having an interesting impact on rural places too. So, kind of fitting into that other segment of migration where we can move without actually moving, right? We can work in a lot of places without actually being there. And that's a really interesting dimension of rural growth.
It certainly is. It kind of reminds me of the suitcase farming phenomenon in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. When you start to think of, when farming became less labor intensive and people didn't need to live on the farm or be there all the time, they could work in the city and then come back to the farm. And here we have something that, is very, very similar in the sense that people can technically have their job in the city, but not actually have to be there for most of the time, or only be in person on occasion. So it is an interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way, Mike, but yeah, it is an interesting flashback to a certain point in time, right?
Well, it's just one perspective, though, and
Mhm.
I'm sure there are a number of other complexities as well as there are with other kinds of migration. So you look at urban to rural migration quite a bit then throughout the world.
So, you know, when I finished at Kansas State, I went to Morehead State University in Eastern Kentucky, and I worked at the the Institute for Regional Analysis and Public
Mm-hmm.
Policy. It was focused on Appalachia.
Sure.
While I was there, I had the opportunity both to work in Appalachia, but also to do a Fulbright Haze, which took me to Mongolia. And that was a very big turning point for me because I'd always been interested in remote communities in other parts of the world, but I that wasn't my specialty. And so I spent some time on that. It was a 1 month sort of study away type program for faculty. And my roommate for that summer was Cynthia Werner, who I went on to work with for many years, and we still collaborate here and there on different things. But she was an expert in Kazakh culture and gift giving, and my background was in migration, rural places. And so we started working in Western Mongolia, and we've done that now for almost 20 years. It's been a long time since we started those projects, and many of our research assistants there now are faculty in their own right and still collaborate with us. But that type of migration, the question of when you start thinking about how that part of the world transitioned in the early 1990s, even up until the present, the change in the economic structures, the change in the governance structures, and the changing migration flows, that really sparked that interest in, well, when we look at rural places and we think about remote rural places, how do the economies and governance structures and personal decisions begin to play into the patterns that we're seeing? And, that rural to urban actually is the major flow there. And so, transnational, but also then internal migration. So a lot of dimensions of migration that I've looked at over the years.
So certainly rural to urban is the norm, but
Mhm.
there is also the urban to rural that is
Yeah.
touched upon. But this matter of Mongolia is very interesting because we don't see many geographers in our discipline's history look at Mongolia very seriously. I think of Owen Lattimore
Mhm.
and in the 30s and in the 40s. Well, no, and also through the 60s he did as well. But and I think Gordon Matsky at Oregon State did some things with regard to grazing and things of that nature, and there are a couple of others, but there are very few geographers that do work in Central Asia. You're very rare, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's a number of people around, but you're right. I mean, Mongolia tends to attract a cross section of academics, and people do a lot of collaborative work there. So when you think about rangeland management, those projects tend to have biologists and rangeland managers and geographers and
Hmm.
anthropologists and so forth. And as a geographer, you're always trained to work with other people, and so those teams tend to work out really well because you can't know everything there is about a place. You can do your best, but to be honest, there's so many different perspectives and there's so many different ways to look at the world that working in teams, collaborating, being able to leverage different technologies, whether it's GIS or remote sensing or survey technologies and techniques, those are really important skills for geographers, and they transcend different places. Place knowledge is one thing, but the ability to use some of your skills in different places is also an important
Yes.
aspect of being a geographer.
Indeed. I think one of the gifts that we have as geographers is our ability to engage in dialogue with those who are in other fields because we know just enough to ask the right questions to facilitate a greater understanding of a place. And we
Right.
concentrate on the place as opposed to another phenomenon.
Right. Well, that spatial perspective, that willingness to think about the different processes, whether they're ecological processes or economic processes or social processes that create a place, whether, again, from a natural perspective or from a human perspective, these all come together and they become really important too. And we're thinking about some of the big questions right now that humanity faces, right? How is climate change going to affect where people live and how they move around the Earth's surface, and how do governance structures influence that? All of that, of course, Mike, are essential questions that we're all facing, and the ability to speak across different groups of people and to speak to different groups of people, I think is essential.
Absolutely. Have you brought students to Mongolia?
I've brought a couple of students. I think one of the great things about working at an undergraduate institution is that we have lots of talented students with lots of energy, and a few of those students have been able to accompany me to Mongolia. One of the downsides is by the time they realize they're ready to do research or want to do research in a faraway place, they're just about to graduate. So you have such a short period of time with those groups of students. But I have had not only students with me, but so many students that have gone on to work in Mongolia in different capacities and with different organizations. And so that has been really rewarding too, to keep in touch with them. And, I've taught a field school in Mongolia as well, and that had students from all over the world in it. And so keeping up with that group of students as they bring their knowledge back to their home countries or home communities, I think really helps inform how we're looking at, in rural places in Mongolia, this intersection of ecosystem, environment, and social structures. I think that's essential.
Well, and it also spreads the word about the importance of the geographic discipline by being able to reach out to those students in the field school.
Oh, absolutely. And so many of them weren't necessarily geographers. It was a field school for people who were interested in this case, in the course I was teaching, in migration. So you draw from so many different disciplines, right? I mean, migration is so interdisciplinary, but geography brings that spatial lens, that ability to see, at different scales, what's happening at the micro level, within the household, what are the decisions that are being made, as well as what are the implications of those decisions on places and on groups of people that might not be immediately in that area.
No. Let's follow up with this migration field that you have been pursuing, because it is fascinating, and we see that it doesn't stop, right? And we see that you've done some really interesting work, especially with regard to different ethnic groups that have migrated, especially in the United States. Would you care to comment on African migrants in urban areas, or perhaps even migrants from Latin America?
So I think most of the work that I have done in the U.S. has looked at rural areas, and primarily the Great Plains and Appalachia, and the changing trajectory of migrants, and in particular Latino migrants, into rural places. And one of the things that is really interesting to me is that when we look at different ethnic groups, and we begin to really disaggregate by country of origin, that we see very different patterns of settlement and social mobility. When we look at the Great Plains, we can identify areas in which we see groups coming from particular countries, engaging in particular economic activities, and then sometimes staying and sometimes using that as a springboard into another part of the country, another economic, another level of just social mobility, economic achievement. And it is so highly differentiated, and it changes so quickly. And we can look at that across urban areas too. And at Macalester, we do a lot of work that's in the local community, and we have lots of residents who are from many different countries, and they coming for economic reasons, coming for political reasons, and the different settlement patterns and long-term trajectories of these different population groups, I think over time continues to fuel my interest in, like, how do people make decisions? Why are they settling in the places that they're settling? Because the answer is never simple. the answer is always very complex and involves all these different scales of analysis and engagement.
It certainly is complex, and I think as social scientists, we do seek to generalize, but sometimes it just doesn't work.
Well, I think, I think you have to strike a balance, right? Every experience is important, but also finding those trends, finding those commonalities helps us better understand how people are adapting to different places, how they're imagining their place in that space. And I think there's a balance there because we can take things up to a super general level, and then we're not learning a whole lot. But if we can bring it up a couple levels where we can find areas that are ideas that are of interest to different groups. So why does this group settle in this area? When we talk to people who are part of that particular ethnic or racial or demographic group more broadly, we find out a lot about how they're making decisions. And so we can generalize, but I think of course the challenge is always not to generalize so much that we've lost the meaning of what's been conveyed.
Oh, absolutely. That is a challenge. And you just offered a very profound explanation of striking that balance, really, and the need to. Thank you for that. I'd like to ask you about your experience at Macalester. Certainly different than teaching in Kentucky and going to school in Charlotte or in Manhattan.
The Little Apple.
I guess so.
It is different. But what I find is most compelling is that in every single place that I've been, students are really interested in learning. And students come with different backgrounds, different interests, different imaginations of what their future is. But at the core, we really start thinking about, what's the advantage or disadvantage of being in any one place or another. It really comes down to how do we understand this place and why is it important that, I'm working in, for example, when I was at Morehead State, we're working in Eastern Kentucky, and we did a lot of work with students in the field looking at housing challenges that in the local community. So there's a lot of local knowledge that students brought to that particular project. At Macalester, we have a very different student population, which tends not to be from the local area, although we have a handful that do come from the local area. So when we go out and we engage in a particular project, we're bringing in ideas that are global because the students are coming from other parts of the world, other parts of the country. But I think at the core of it, the students who are there are really interested in learning, and we move from that platform of we're all here to learn, the faculty and the students, and how do we broaden our each of our understandings of how processes work.
So in a sense, it's a matter of scale.
It is a matter of scale, and it's I don't know. I guess I've been lucky in that I've always worked with enthusiastic students, and like I said, they come from different backgrounds, but when we're all in the classroom, we can have a conversation around whatever topic that we're interested in. Yeah.
Oh, you've done considerable work for the AAG, the American Association of Geographers, and the IGU, the International Geographical Union. Would you care to comment on what you've done in terms of in an official capacity for those two organizations, and what purpose might they serve, and how might participation in those organizations contribute to the development of an aspiring geographer?
I think whichever organization you choose, being engaged with other geographers, the AAG is here, it's in the United States, it has regional organizations, it has student funded, opportunities, they've got great sort of career trajectory advice and opportunities to engage in webinars and that type of thing, and the annual meeting. And so the AAG really is that fundamental. If you are in the US and want to engage with this community, it's one of the biggest in the world, right? I mean, this is one of the most influential geography organizations, and you have access to all these phenomenal researchers and people who are working out in industry who all come to these conferences and are engaged and excited about geography. The IGU looks globally. You know, they have these two organizations have different functions, and the IGU seeks to bring different groups of geographers from different nation states together. So it takes that next, you know, sort of, if we're thinking about scale, that next step up in bringing geographers from all over the world together. And so then from that perspective, you're looking at lots and lots of geographers that have perspectives that come from countries in Africa, countries in South America, countries in Asia, countries in Europe. And those are different perspectives. And I think that what the IGU really does is build bridges across communities. So communities of geographers and geographers that have very similar research agendas, but maybe different ways of approaching those research questions. In both, I think in the AAG, I've worked with different specialty groups. I've been on different, you know, dissertation committees and nominating committees and that type of thing. In the IGU, I worked for many years with at the commission level on the Commission for the Sustainability of Rural Systems. And from there, then 4 years ago, I was elected as part of the executive committee. And so the executive committee is 10 to 12 members each from a different country, representing the broad range of both human and physical geography interests, and trying to keep momentum forward on collaborations across countries. So really that international dimension of geography. And, you know, we live in a global world, and in many ways it's hard to imagine that we can't move around that world. But I think COVID taught us that very quickly. A world that we can move around in easily can become a world that's difficult to move around in. And it's also difficult depending on where you're coming from. What country are you coming from? What country are you trying to go to? Those types of mobility challenges often keep people from building bridges. And I think IGU, because it has regional meetings in different regions of the world, it has a big Congress every couple of years. Those are places where geographers from across the globe are able to come together.
Well, and thematic conferences as well.
Absolutely. Yep.
You know,
Yep. Where the different commissions will collaborate.
Those can be quite good. Do you recommend to any of your students to join one of the commissions as a corresponding member?
Yeah. So IGU is interesting in the fact that it doesn't cost anything to join.
Right.
You email the commission chair, and you can be added to their listserv, and you can join them virtually in any of the discussions that they have. You can also join most of the commissions have an annual conference or get together. They tend to be smaller groups of people, so you really get to know people well. And yes, absolutely, I recommend getting to know those groups. They're super friendly. I think that's one of the hallmarks of the IGU, is that people are there to meet other people who do like kinds of work and to learn about what they're doing around the world. So absolutely, students should get involved.
Well, I am a firm believer in that as well. I've recommended to my students who are very interested specific commissions to join as corresponding members, and I've been to a couple of thematic conferences, and I find them to be very rich and rewarding. So it is another outlet. But as you indicated, the AAG is like the big kid on the block, really. The AAG is considered to have a superb forum for the meeting of American geographers and those from across the globe. But unfortunately, not all geographers across the globe can take part in the annual conferences.
Yeah, that is one of the really hard things. The US is sometimes very, very difficult to enter, to get a visa for. So, right, I think they work in synergy. They are very complementary organizations, and they have kind of different missions, but all about supporting geography. And the AAG does a great job of reaching out into the US, and IGU tries to keep geographers connected with the UN and the International Science Council and other sort of global academic organizations. So it's a really nice, well, like I said, it's a nice synergy between the two.
That it is. We have about a minute to go, Holly, and I'm going to ask you to consider your background, the path that you have trod, and perhaps offer some words of advice for students interested in geography, either undergraduates or those that are conducting graduate research, and then maybe even offer some insight to colleagues in geography.
I think I've been lucky to receive a lot of insights from colleagues. And one of the things that I would say to geographers, and aspiring geographers, students in particular, is really pursue what you're interested in. Think big, because geography answers big questions, or seeks to answer big questions. And there are so many people across the world who are geographers who want to engage. And so, wherever you are, especially now with our global communication systems, you can be engaged in other places with other people in other, conversations. I say, just jump in, just do it. There's a lot that you can accomplish. And geography really needs young, early career, new voices. To continue, exploring and thinking about big ideas that relate to place, that relate to people, that relate to climate. So that's what I would have to say. Jump in, do it, get involved. There's lots of people to support you.
That's great. Holly, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time to discuss your life and your career in geography.
Well, thanks, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity, and I hope we can see each other soon.
Well, it sounds great. I hope so too. And this concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.